Sherman was soon promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers. Sherman was then reassigned to the Army of the Cumberland in the Kentucky Theater by the now promoted General Anderson of Fort Sumter fame. The South claimed the North tilting Kentucky and had considerable forces in Tennessee ready to move on Kentucky. Anderson then sent Sherman north to Indiana, Illinois, and St. Louis to gather more forces to defend Kentucky. However, he had little luck as their forces were already spoken for. Upon his return to Louisville, Kentucky, Sherman found the legislature had declared for the North and that Confederate forces were on the move to take the state. Sherman mustered what troops he could and began building defenses for the city. By October, more troops arrived, and Sherman had a division of 2 brigades. On October 8th, General Anderson suddenly resigned his command, and Sherman, being the senior officer, had to take over. Sherman did not want the position and complained to Washington, feeling that Lincoln himself had violated a promise not to place him in a senior command. Within a short time, Sherman was to face his lowest point in the war when Secretary of War Simon Cameron visited Sherman. Cameron asked Sherman for a frank assessment of the Kentucky theater. Present with Cameron were several members of the press whom Cameron, even after Sherman's protest, assured were friendly. Sherman spoke freely that his forces were inadequate to defend Kentucky and the Confederates could take Louisville any day. Cameron was surprised and said he had heard otherwise from his sources. Sherman went on to state that he needed 60,000 armed men simply to defend his 300-mile Kentucky front and 200,000 men to go on the offensive. Sherman wrote that he had tried to impress upon Cameron of the great war that was before us and was in fact upon us. Cameron returned to Washington and spoke of these insane estimates. The newspapers picked this up and throughout the nation declared Sherman as insane and crazy. Sherman's private meeting with Cameron, attended by the reporters, now became public information, of which Major General Thomas Wood, eyewitness to the meeting, wrote some years later. All military men were shocked by the gross breach of faith which had been committed. Sherman then reported to the new commander-in-chief of all the armies, General McClellan, of the situation and emphasized that our enemies have a terrible advantage in the fact that in our midst they have active partisans who seemingly pursue their usual calling but are in fact spies. On November 12, 1861, as previously planned, Sherman was relieved of his command by General Don Carlos Buell. Sherman then reported to Major General Henry Halleck in St. Louis, Missouri. Sherman himself wrote in his memoirs that he had to admit that there was some truth that the stress of the situation affected his judgment and mind. Halleck commented that the newspaper articles were the grossest injustice and that he had the fullest confidence in Sherman. In less than a month, Sherman was back at work. History shows that Sherman's insane troop estimates were surprisingly prescient as the war dragged on. On March 10th, Sherman received his orders from General Halleck to move out his division to Fort Henry. For the rest of March, Sherman maneuvered and scouted the lands around the river, eventually ending up at Pittsburgh Landing near Shiloh, Tennessee. By then, the Confederate forces planned to attack Grant and separate the Union Army from its gunboat support. However, heavy rain slowed the Confederate Army and delayed them by 2 days. This delay would allow the Union Army to receive reinforcements. Regardless, the Union Army was ill-prepared and the Confederate forces surprised the Union forces on April 6th. Sherman himself had miscalculated the size and locations of the Confederate forces. The Confederate assault, although disorganized, was fierce and drove back many of the inexperienced Union forces. Sherman's division bore the main assault. I saw the rebel lines of battle in front coming down on us as far as the eye could reach. Sherman wrote of himself in the battle rather indifferently, simply reporting the battle as he saw it. History records that during the two-day battle, Sherman was a critical element of the Union victory. He continuously moved along his lines and inspired his troops, even with staggering losses on both sides. During the two-day battle, Sherman was wounded twice, once in the hand and once in the shoulder, and had 3 horses shot out from under him. Still, he remained in the fight. The night after the first day's battle, Sherman found Grant standing under a tree during a pouring rain. "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" Yes. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." On the second day, the Union reinforcements were in place, and after a day of severe fighting, the exhausted Confederate forces withdrew. After the battle, Sherman, with 2 of his brigades and 2 battalions of cavalry, was sent out on a reconnaissance mission. After a short but fierce battle in a field of fallen trees, Sherman determined that the Confederate forces were not going to attack again and withdrew back to the Union camps. Sherman emerged from the Battle of Shiloh as a hero, and cries of his insanity ceased. Sherman recorded in his report over 2,000 casualties in his division. The battle itself was the costliest in American history up to that time, though worse battles would follow. As a result of Sherman's actions at Shiloh, he was promoted to Major General of Volunteers on May 1, 1862.
Liftoff of Delta rocket carrier flights. Gathering telescope searching for unseen physics, stars,